He thought stopping her would protect his secret, but in less than 10 minutes, the truth would echo through that room in a way no one could silence. The ballroom of the Caldwell Grand Hotel shimmered under layers of golden chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished marble floors so flawlessly they mirrored every step taken across them. A quiet orchestra of heels clicking and glasses clinking filling the air as some of the most influential names in the city gathered beneath its high ceilings, dressed in tailored suits and evening gowns that whispered wealth without ever needing to announce it. And at the center of it all stood a black Steinway grand piano, pristine and untouched, positioned beneath a spotlight like a throne waiting for someone worthy, though everyone in that room believed they already knew exactly who that someone would be. And it certainly wasn't the elderly woman who had just stepped through the entrance unnoticed by most, but not by all. Sister Eleanor Vance moved slowly, her worn black habit simple against the backdrop of luxury, her hands folded gently at her waist, her steps quiet but deliberate as if she had walked into places like this before, though nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged among crystal chandeliers and million-dollar donations. A few guests glanced her way, their eyes lingering just a second too long before turning away, curiosity quickly replaced by subtle judgment. And near the center of the room, Richard Caldwell noticed her too, his sharp gaze narrowing slightly as he adjusted the cuff of his tailored tuxedo, the kind of man who had built his empire on control and precision, the kind who noticed details others ignored. And right now, that detail was a nun who had no place in his carefully curated evening. He didn't rush. He never rushed. Instead, he watched her approach the piano area with a quiet tension settling in his jaw, his mind already calculating, already questioning, already deciding, while across the room, donors continued their conversations unaware that something small but significant was unfolding just beneath the surface of their perfect evening. Sister Eleanor paused just a few feet from the piano, her eyes lifting to it not with admiration, not with hesitation, but with recognition, as if she were greeting something familiar, something that had been waiting for her as much as she had been waiting for it. And for a brief moment, everything around her seemed to dim, the chatter fading into a distant hum, the light softening, the world narrowing to a single point of quiet connection, until a voice cut cleanly through the air. "Excuse me, ma'am." Richard Caldwell stepped forward, his tone polite but edged with something firmer beneath it, something unmistakably final, his presence alone enough to draw the attention of those nearby. Conversations lowering just slightly as eyes began to shift in their direction, he offered a thin smile, one practiced over years of controlling rooms like this. "This area is reserved for performers," he said, his voice measured, controlled, leaving no room for misunderstanding. And for a moment, Sister Eleanor simply looked at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady in a way that didn't quite match the way others usually reacted when confronted by a man like him. "I understand," she replied softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength that didn't rise above the noise yet somehow reached him clearly. "I was only hoping to play." A faint murmur rippled through the nearest guests, subtle, restrained, but present, and Richard let out a quiet breath through his nose, his smile tightening just slightly as he shook his head. "I'm afraid tonight's program is already arranged," he said, glancing briefly toward the piano as if to reinforce the boundary. "We can't allow unexpected additions." The pause was brief but intentional, his words landing exactly as he intended them to. And somewhere in the room, a soft chuckle escaped before quickly being stifled, the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to be cruel, but wasn't kind either. Sister Eleanor didn't react, not outwardly. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't even step back right away. Instead, her gaze shifted once more to the piano, lingering there for just a second longer than before, as if measuring something unseen, as if listening to something no one else could hear. And then, quietly, she nodded. "Of course," she said, her voice as gentle as before. But there was something else now, something almost imperceptible beneath the surface, something that didn't belong to someone who had just been dismissed. And as she turned slightly, as if preparing to step away, Richard Caldwell felt it, not a threat, not yet, but a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, something that made him hold his gaze on her just a moment longer than necessary, because somewhere deep down, though he would never admit it, Something about that woman didn't fit the story he had already decided for her. And the room, still glowing with elegance and quiet superiority, had no idea it was standing just seconds away from hearing a truth it had spent years trying to bury. The moment she turned away, the illusion of the evening quietly stitched itself back together. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked again, and the soft hum of wealth and influence returned as if nothing unusual had occurred. Yet something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, something almost imperceptible but present all the same. Because Sister Eleanor Vance did not walk like someone dismissed. She walked like someone who had simply adjusted her timing. And across the ballroom, a few eyes followed her without quite understanding why, including one that lingered longer than the rest. Lydia Monroe stood near the far end of the room beside a tall arrangement of white orchids, her fingers lightly wrapped around a crystal glass she had not lifted in several minutes. Her expression composed, elegant, practiced, yet her gaze had fixed on the nun with an intensity she could not immediately explain. There was something familiar in the way the woman had looked at the piano, not admiration, not curiosity, but recognition, and that word settled uncomfortably in her chest as she turned her attention away, forcing herself back into the rhythm of polite conversation. While at the center of the room, Richard Caldwell had already shifted his focus to a group of investors, his voice smooth, confident, controlled, the earlier interruption dismissed as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Yet every now and then, without intending to, his eyes drifted back to where the nun had been standing, as if some part of him was still trying to reconcile the calm in her response with the outcome he had expected, because most people, when turned away in a room like this, carried something with them, embarrassment, frustration, even quiet resentment, but she had carried none of it, and that absence lingered in his thoughts longer than it should have. As the evening program continued to unfold, a string quartet performed near the balcony, their music elegant and precise, blending seamlessly into the atmosphere. Waitstaff moved with practiced efficiency, refilling glasses, clearing plates, maintaining the illusion of effortless perfection, and yet beneath it all, a tension began to build, not loud, not obvious, but steady, like a quiet note held just beneath hearing. And then it happened. Not with drama, not with chaos, but with a small, almost inconvenient disruption. The scheduled pianist, a young prodigy flown in from New York, had not yet arrived. At first it was dismissed as a delay, then a miscommunication, but as minutes stretched into nearly 15, the quiet concern among the event coordinators grew harder to conceal. Whispered conversations formed near the stage, phones were checked, messages sent, and for the first time that evening, Richard Caldwell felt something he did not often experience: uncertainty. His jaw tightened as he glanced toward the empty piano bench, the centerpiece of the evening now sitting and used under its spotlight, a symbol of something slipping just slightly out of his control. And though he maintained his composure outwardly, his mind moved quickly, calculating alternatives, weighing options, because failure was not something he allowed, especially not in a room filled with people whose approval he had spent years cultivating. Across the room, Lydia Monroe noticed it too, the subtle shift in energy, the way the music from the quartet suddenly felt insufficient, like a placeholder rather than a performance. And again, without intending to, her gaze drifted, searching, until it found her. Sister Eleanor stood near a side corridor now, partially removed from the main crowd, her hands once again folded gently, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet yet somehow anchored, as if she were waiting, not impatiently, not hopefully, but with a kind of certainty that did not belong in a situation like this, and for reasons she could not fully articulate. Lydia felt a chill run through her, a memory brushing against the edges of her mind, something tied to music, to a melody she had not thought about in years, something she had long convinced herself was buried, gone, irrelevant. And yet now, standing in a room filled with wealth and carefully maintained appearances, that forgotten echo began to stir, faint but persistent, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to return. And though no one said it aloud, though no one could yet see how the pieces connected, the absence of one pianist had created a space, and in that space, something far more powerful was about to step forward, something no One in that room was prepared to hear, least of all the man who believed he had already decided who belonged and who did not. The longer the piano remained untouched, the heavier the silence beneath the music became, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once it settled into the room like an unspoken question, and Richard Caldwell felt it more than anyone, not because others noticed, but because he understood perception. He understood that in rooms like this, perfection was not optional, it was expected, and even the smallest crack could invite doubt. His fingers tightened briefly around the stem of his glass. Before he set it down, already turning toward one of his coordinators whose expression confirmed what he had begun to suspect, the pianist was not coming, delayed indefinitely, unreachable, a situation that could not be explained away without consequence. And for a brief moment, the polished rhythm of the evening faltered, just enough for those paying close attention to feel it. The quartet continued playing, but their sound now carried the weight of filling a gap they were never meant to fill. And across the room, Lydia Monroe felt that same shift deepen, her heartbeat subtly out of sync with the music as her gaze once again found its way to the figure near the corridor. Sister Eleanor had not moved much, yet there was a quiet awareness about her now, as if she had been expecting this moment long before anyone else realized it had arrived, and Lydia's fingers tightened around her glass, the chill from it pressing into her skin as a memory pushed forward more insistently, not fully formed, not yet clear, but undeniable, a melody, distant and fragile, threading through her thoughts like something half-remembered from another life, something tied to a room much smaller than this one, with no chandeliers, no polished marble, just an old upright piano and a voice guiding her through notes she once struggled to understand. She blinked, pulling herself back to the present, but the feeling did not fade. It lingered, persistent, as if waiting for confirmation, as if waiting for a single sound to bring it fully to life. Meanwhile, Richard Caldwell had already made his decision. There would be no disruption, no visible flaw. He would adapt. He always did. Stepping forward with the same calm authority that had built his reputation, he addressed a small group near the stage, his voice low but firm, instructing them to extend the current program, to maintain flow, to buy time. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes shifted once more, drawn unwillingly toward the piano, and then beyond it, to the woman he had already dismissed, and for the first time that evening. A thought crossed his mind that he did not like, not because it was logical, but because it felt like a risk, and Richard Caldwell did not deal in risks he could not control. Still, the absence of options pressed against him, narrowing his choices, forcing him to consider possibilities he would have otherwise ignored. And across the room, as if sensing the exact moment that hesitation formed, Sister Eleanor lifted her gaze, not toward him directly, but toward the piano, her eyes steady, patient, as if she had been waiting for permission that no one had yet given. And then, quietly, she began to move, her steps slow but certain as she left the shadow of the corridor and walked back toward the center of the room. A few guests noticed, their conversations softening as their attention followed her path. There was no announcement, no invitation, just the sound of her shoes against marble, measured, unhurried, deliberate, and something about that walk drew silence behind it, not commanded, not forced, but natural, like the room itself was holding its breath without understanding why. Richard saw her approach and felt a flicker of resistance rise in his chest, his instinct to stop her. Immediate, almost reflexive, but something held him back, not doubt, not yet, but curiosity edged with something sharper, something he could not fully define. And as Sister Eleanor reached the piano, she did not look at him. She did not ask again. She simply rested her hand lightly on the polished surface, her fingers tracing it for a brief second, as if reconnecting with something long separated. And in that instant, Lydia Monroe's breath caught, because the memory she had been trying to grasp finally began to take shape, not complete, not fully understood, but close enough now to feel real, close enough to know that whatever was about to happen next would not be contained within music alone. And across the entire ballroom, the air shifted, conversations faded into nothing, and a silence fell, deep and expectant, the kind of silence that comes just before something irreversible begins. For a fraction of a second, no one moved, as if the entire room had collectively forgotten how to breathe. because what was happening did not follow the rules they were used to. It did not wait for permission. It did not ask for approval. It simply unfolded, and Richard Caldwell felt it immediately. That quiet shift from control to uncertainty, his voice catching just before he could speak, his instinct urging him to step forward and stop her again, to reassert order, to remind everyone that this evening had been carefully designed and that nothing outside that design was acceptable. But something held him in place, something subtle but firm, like an invisible line he could not quite cross. And so he watched, along with everyone else, as Sister Eleanor Vance lowered herself onto the piano bench. With calm precision, her movements unhurried, unshaken, her posture straight, her hands resting gently in her lap for a brief moment before she lifted them toward the keys. And in that pause, that small, quiet pause before the first note, the room tightened, anticipation settling like a weight pressing against every polished surface, every crystal glass, every carefully composed expression. Lydia Monroe felt it most of all, her heart beating louder now, the memory within her no longer distant, no longer unclear, but rising rapidly to the surface with a sense of urgency she could not ignore, because she knew, without knowing how she knew, that whatever sound came next would not simply be music, it would be recognition. And then it began, not with power, not with spectacle, but with a single, soft note, clear and deliberate, cutting through the silence like light through glass, followed by another, and then another, forming a melody so simple it might have gone unnoticed in any other setting. But here, in this room built on perfection and expectation, it felt different, it felt intentional, and as the notes continued, weaving together into something richer, something layered and precise, the subtle murmurs that had lingered at the edges of the room disappeared completely, replaced by a stillness that deepened with each passing second. Because this was not amateur playing, this was not improvisation, this was control, discipline, and something more, something that could not be taught or imitated, something that could only come from a lifetime of understanding. And Richard Caldwell felt his jaw tighten, the certainty he had carried all evening beginning to fracture in small, quiet ways, his mind searching for explanation, for logic, for some way to reconcile what he was hearing with what he believed to be true. But there was none, not yet. And across the room, Lydia Monroe's breath caught as the melody shifted, just slightly, just enough to unlock something she had been holding back for years, her fingers trembling against the glass in her hand as the sound reached deeper into her memory, pulling forward a moment she had long buried, a dimly lit room, a younger version of herself sitting at an old piano, struggling through a passage she could not quite master, and a voice, calm, patient, guiding her through it, not correcting, not judging, simply showing her how to listen, how to feel the space between notes, how to understand the story behind them. And now, standing in a ballroom filled with strangers, that same story was unfolding again, note by note, undeniable, unmistakable, her eyes fixed on the woman at the piano as realization began to form, fragile at first, then stronger, heavier, until it settled fully into place, and she whispered, barely audible even to herself, "No, it cannot be." But it was, because the melody was not just familiar, it was personal. It was a piece that had never been published, never performed publicly, something that had existed only between teacher and student, something that should not be here, could not be here, and yet it was, echoing through the room with a quiet authority that no one could interrupt, no one could deny. And as the music grew, expanding into something more complex, more revealing, the room responded in the only way it could, with silence, complete and absolute. The kind that does not come from politeness but from recognition, from the understanding that something important is happening and that speaking would only diminish it. And in that silence, Richard Caldwell finally felt it. Not just uncertainty now, but the first sharp edge of something else, something far more dangerous, because whatever this woman was playing, whatever truth it carried within it, was no longer contained to the piano. It was spreading, reaching into the people around him, into the past he had worked so carefully to keep separate from the present, and for the first time that evening, he was no longer certain that he could stop it. The melody did not rush, it did not try to impress, It unfolded with a quiet certainty that drew every ear deeper into its structure, each note placed with intention, each pause carrying meaning. And as Sister Eleanor's fingers moved across the keys, the music began to evolve, shifting from something delicate and reflective into something more defined, more revealing, like a story that had waited years to be told and had finally found its moment. And Lydia Monroe felt it fully now, not just recognition but confirmation. Her breath unsteady as the memory she had tried to suppress for so long rose completely to the surface. She could see it clearly now, the old piano in a modest room, the soft afternoon light through a narrow window, and the woman beside her, younger then, not in a habit but in simple clothes, guiding her hands with patience and quiet encouragement, teaching her not just how to play but how to listen, how to understand the emotion behind each note. And that melody, the one now echoing through the grand ballroom, had been their piece, unfinished, private, something never shared beyond those walls, something that had ended abruptly when that woman disappeared without explanation, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions. And now here it was again, alive, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Lydia's fingers trembled as she lowered her glass onto a nearby table. The faint sound of crystal meeting would barely audible against the music. Her eyes locked on Sister Eleanor as the truth began to settle into her expression, while across the room, Richard Caldwell stood completely still, his usual composure slipping in ways so subtle only he could feel them, his thoughts moving faster now, searching for connections, for reasons, for anything that could explain how this woman, this nun he had dismissed so easily, could be sitting at his piano playing something that felt so deeply personal to a past he had carefully sealed away. And then it happened. The melody shifted again, this time more distinctly, the progression altering just enough to introduce a sequence that had not been there before, something new woven into something old, and Lydia's eyes widened as she recognized it instantly, not from memory, but from absence, because this was the part they had never finished, the part they had struggled with, the part that had remained unresolved. And yet now it was complete, fully formed, resolved with a clarity that carried both beauty and weight. And with that resolution came something else, something far more significant than music, because embedded within those final measures was a message, not spoken but undeniable, a continuation that could only have come from someone who knew exactly where the original had ended, someone who had lived that unfinished moment and carried it forward alone. And Lydia felt her composure break, just slightly, her voice barely above a whisper as she said the name she had not spoken in years. Eleanor. The word slipping out before she could stop it, and though it was quiet, it carried just enough for those closest to her to turn, just enough for Richard Caldwell to hear it, his head shifting sharply in her direction, his expression tightening as realization began to press against him, slow at first, then faster, more insistent, because the pieces were no longer scattered, they were aligning, forming a picture he had never intended to face again. And at the piano, Sister Eleanor did not look up, did not acknowledge the reaction. She continued playing, her expression calm, her focus steady, as if the music itself was the only language that mattered, the only way this truth could be revealed. And as the final notes approached, the room seemed to lean forward collectively, every person drawn into the moment whether they understood it or not, because something undeniable was happening, something that could not be undone. And when the last note finally rang out, clear and resonant, it did not fade quickly, it lingered, hanging in the air like a question that demanded an answer. And in that silence that followed, no one moved, no one spoke, because whatever had just been revealed was not simply a performance, it was a reckoning, and every person in that room could feel it, whether they were ready to face it or not. For several long seconds after the final note faded, the room remained suspended in a silence so complete it felt almost unreal, as if every person present had been pulled out of their own world and placed into something they did not yet understand. And in that stillness, Sister Eleanor Vance slowly lifted her hands from the piano keys, resting them gently in her lap once more, her expression unchanged, calm and steady, as though what had just happened was neither unexpected nor extraordinary to her, but simply inevitable. And across the room, Lydia Monroe could no longer hold herself in place. the weight of recognition too strong to ignore as she took a step forward, then another, her composure slipping with each movement, her carefully maintained elegance giving way to something far more human, far more vulnerable. Because the music had not just reminded her of the past, it had brought it back in full, undeniable detail. And now she stood only a few feet away from the woman she had believed was gone forever, her voice trembling as she spoke again, louder this time. "Eleanor, it really is you." The words carrying across the quiet room, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. And for the first time since the performance began, Sister Eleanor turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Lydia's with a softness that held both recognition and something deeper, something that spoke of years past. And choices made. "Hello, Lydia," she said gently, her voice as composed as her posture. And that simple exchange was enough to shift the entire atmosphere, because now the moment had a name. It had a connection. It was no longer just a performance. It was personal, and Richard Caldwell felt it hit him with a force he could not deflect, his breath tightening as he stepped forward, his polished confidence cracking under the weight of what he was beginning to understand. "You know her?" he asked, his voice lower now, sharper, directed at Lydia but carrying an urgency that betrayed his need for clarity. And Lydia did not look at him right away, her attention still fixed on Eleanor, as if confirming what her heart already knew. "She was my teacher," Lydia said finally, her voice steadying just enough to be heard clearly. "Years ago, before she disappeared." A murmur rippled through the room, quiet but unmistakable, and Richard's expression hardened as the words settled into place. Disappeared, because that was not a word he had ever associated with the past he had constructed so carefully. That was not a narrative he had allowed to exist, and yet here it was, spoken aloud in front of witnesses. Carried on the same air that had moments ago held nothing but admiration and polite conversation, and he turned his gaze back to Eleanor, studying her now not as an outsider, but as a variable he had failed to account for. "You left," Lydia continued, her voice carrying both confusion and emotion. "You never said why." And for a moment, the room seemed to lean closer, drawn not just to the people involved, but to the truth hovering just beyond reach, waiting to be spoken. And Sister Eleanor rose slowly from the bench, her movements measured, deliberate, as she faced Lydia fully. "Some departures are not choices," she said softly, her words simple yet weighted with meaning. And Richard felt something tighten in his chest, not fear exactly, but recognition of something he had long avoided, because he knew, even before the next words were spoken, that whatever truth this woman carried was not separate from him. It was connected, directly, undeniably. And as Eleanor's gaze shifted briefly in his direction, just for a moment, it was enough to confirm what he had been trying not to see, enough to bring the past he had buried into the present he could no longer control. And in that moment, the balance of the room shifted completely, because the power no longer belonged to the man who had built the evening. It belonged to the woman he had tried to exclude, and the truth she carried was no longer hidden. It was waiting, just one step away from being spoken aloud. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched, deep and heavy, as if the room itself understood that whatever came next would not simply fill the space, but redefine it entirely. And Sister Eleanor Vance stood there with quiet composure, her presence no longer blending into the background, but anchoring the moment, while Lydia Monroe's eyes searched her face for answers that had been denied for years. And Richard Caldwell remained just behind them, his posture rigid, his expression controlled but strained beneath the surface, because he could feel it now with certainty. The past he had buried was no longer distant. It was standing in front of him, breathing the same air, commanding the attention he had once reserved only for himself. And he spoke again, his voice measured but edged with tension. "What do you mean it was not a choice?" His words directed at Eleanor, but carrying the weight of something far deeper, something he was not yet ready to hear. And Eleanor did not rush to answer. She let the question settle, let the room absorb it, her gaze moving calmly between Lydia and Richard, as if acknowledging both the personal and the unavoidable truth that connected them. "There are moments," she said slowly, her voice steady and clear, "when silence is not kindness, but survival." The words landed with a quiet force that rippled through the nearest listeners, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and Lydia's breath caught as the meaning began to unfold. "You left without saying anything," Lydia replied, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "You just vanished," and Eleanor inclined her head slightly, not in denial, not in apology, but in acknowledgement, because staying would have changed more than just my life, she said. And now her eyes shifted fully to Richard Caldwell, holding his gaze in a way that no one in that room had ever dared to do. Not with him, not here, and for the first time that evening, Richard felt something he had not prepared for, not control, not calculation, but exposure, as if the carefully constructed version of himself was being quietly dismantled piece by piece, not through accusation, but through truth. And he took a small step forward, unable to remain still any longer. "If you have something to say," he began, his voice tightening slightly, "then say it." The command was there, but weaker than before, no longer absolute. And Eleanor regarded him for a moment, her expression unchanged, her calm unwavering. "You already know," she replied simply, and that was enough. Enough to break through the last layer of denial he had been holding on to. Because he did know, or at least a part of him had always known, the part he had chosen to ignore, to bury beneath years of success and distance. And now it was rising, impossible to contain, while around them, the room remained silent, every guest drawn into the unfolding truth, sensing its weight even if they did not yet understand its details. And Lydia turned slightly toward Richard, her confusion now mixed with something else, something sharper. "What is she talking about?" she asked, her voice no longer uncertain but demanding clarity. And Richard did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on Eleanor, searching her face as if hoping to find some way out, some alternative explanation. But there was none, only the quiet certainty of someone who had waited long enough to speak. And Eleanor took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to make it clear that this moment was no longer avoidable. "The music you heard tonight," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "was never meant for a stage like this." Her eyes flickered briefly to Lydia, then back to Richard. It was meant to remain unfinished. And Lydia's breath caught again, the implication settling in, while Richard felt the final thread of control slip through his grasp. Because unfinished things do not remain hidden forever. They return, they demand completion. And in this case, completion meant truth. And as the weight of that realization settled over the room, no one spoke, no one moved, because they all understood now. Something had been hidden, something significant, and the person who had been dismissed at the door was now the only one who could reveal it. And in that moment, the power had shifted completely, leaving only one question hanging in the silence. What exactly had Richard Caldwell tried so hard to keep buried? No one spoke, not because they were unsure, but because they understood that whatever truth was about to surface would not be something easily dismissed. And Sister Eleanor Vance stood at the center of that silence with a calm that no longer felt quiet but resolute, as if every second that had passed had been leading to this exact moment. Her gaze steady on Richard Caldwell, who now stood without the confidence that had once defined him, his composure still present but strained, like a structure holding under pressure it was never meant to endure. And Lydia Monroe remained between them, her expression shifting from confusion to realization piece by piece. As the fragments of memory, music, and meaning began to align into something undeniable. "You said it was never meant to be finished," Lydia said slowly, her voice careful, as if each word needed to be placed precisely. "But you finished it tonight." And Eleanor gave a small nod, not of pride, not of performance, but of purpose, because it could not remain unfinished any longer, she replied. And then, after a brief pause, she added, "Not after what it was tied to." The words settled heavily, drawing a deeper stillness from the room, and Richard felt it like a tightening around his chest, because now there was no ambiguity left, no distance to hide behind. Whatever this was, it was connected to him, directly, and he stepped forward again, closer this time, his voice lower, sharper. "If you are implying something, then be clear," he said, though the authority in his tone had faded, replaced by something far more fragile. And Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. "I am not implying," she said softly. "I am remembering." and that distinction landed with a quiet force that rippled outward, because memory could not be argued. It could not be dismissed as easily as accusation. It simply existed, and Lydia's breath caught as she looked between them, the realization forming fully now. The foundation, she whispered, her eyes widening slightly. The scholarship program. It started the same year you disappeared, and Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but enough. Enough for Eleanor to see it, enough for Lydia to understand that she was not wrong, and Eleanor continued, her voice steady, her words measured. That program was built on a story, she said. A story of generosity, of transformation, of someone who chose to give back after a life-changing experience. She paused just long enough for the weight of that narrative to settle in the minds of those listening. But the truth behind it was never told. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening, and Richard exhaled slowly, his control slipping not in a single moment, but in layers, each one revealing something he had kept hidden beneath years of careful construction. You do not understand, he said quietly, though his voice lacked the certainty it once carried, and Eleanor's response came without hesitation. I understand more than you think, she said, her gaze unwavering. Because I was there. And that was it. The final piece. The one that connected everything. The one that removed any remaining doubt. And Lydia's hand rose instinctively to her chest, her breath uneven now as the full truth began to settle into place. You mean, she started, but the words faltered, not because she could not speak them, but because she was not sure she was ready to hear them confirmed, and Eleanor stepped forward just slightly, her presence gentle but unyielding. The music you learned, she said, looking directly at Lydia. The discipline, the guidance, the opportunity, none of it was accidental. Her eyes softened for a moment, not with regret, but with honesty. And neither was the reason I had to leave. And Richard closed his eyes. Briefly, just for a second, as if that small moment could hold back what was coming next. But it could not, because the truth was already here, already spoken in fragments that no longer needed explanation. And when he opened them again, the room was no longer his to control. It belonged to the story unfolding in front of him, and to the woman he had tried to turn away at the door. And as the silence returned once more, deeper now, heavier, there was no doubt left in the room, whatever had been hidden behind wealth, behind reputation, behind carefully constructed narratives, was now fully exposed, not through accusation, but through something far more powerful, the undeniable clarity of truth remembered at the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. Richard Caldwell did not speak immediately, not because he did not have words, but because for the first time in years, none of them could restore the version of reality he had carefully maintained, and the silence that followed Eleanor's final statement was no longer uncertain. It was conclusive, settling over the room with a weight that no one attempted to lift, because everyone understood, even without knowing every detail. That something real had just been revealed, something that could not be reshaped into a polished story or softened into a convenient narrative, and Lydia Monroe stood motionless, her eyes still fixed on Eleanor, but now filled with something deeper than recognition, something closer to gratitude mixed with quiet sorrow, because the truth she had just uncovered was not only about the past, it was about the foundation of her present, the opportunities she had been given, the life she had built. All of it now carried a meaning she had never fully understood until this moment, and she took a slow breath before speaking again, her voice steady but softer. You stayed long enough to make sure I would be all right, she said, and Eleanor's expression softened just slightly, the smallest shift, but enough to carry understanding. That was always the intention, she replied, and Lydia nodded, the pieces finally settling into place, not perfectly, not comfortably, but honestly, and across from them, Richard Caldwell stood as the last thread of control slipped from his grasp, his shoulders lowering just slightly, his posture no longer commanding but human, exposed in a way he had not allowed himself to be for decades. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it, stripped of performance, stripped of authority. You could have said something, he said, though the statement lacked accusation. It was not a defense, not a denial. It was something closer to a realization spoken too late. and Eleanor looked at him with calm clarity. "Would you have listened?" she asked gently, and the question did not need an answer because the truth of it hung plainly in the air, undeniable, and Richard lowered his gaze for the first time that evening, not in defeat, but in recognition, because he knew, just as everyone else in that room now knew, that the story he had presented for years had always been incomplete, shaped by omission rather than honesty, and no amount of success could change that. No amount of influence could rewrite what had already been lived, and around them, the guests remained silent, not out of obligation, but out of respect, because the moment no longer belonged to spectacle or status. It belonged to something far more meaningful, something that could not be interrupted without losing its weight. And after a few seconds, Eleanor turned slightly, her attention returning to the piano, not as a stage, not as a symbol, but as something simple and true, and she placed her hand lightly on its surface once more, not to play again, but to close the moment with the same quiet intention with which she had begun it. And then she stepped away, her movement unhurried, her presence no longer questioned, no longer dismissed, as she walked back through the same space where she had once been stopped. But this time, no one stood in her way, no one spoke, no one dared to interrupt the quiet dignity of her departure. And Lydia watched her go, her expression thoughtful, changed, as if something within her had shifted permanently, while Richard remained still, his gaze fixed not on the woman leaving, but on the empty space she left behind, because that space now held something he could not ignore, something that would remain long after the lights dimmed and the guests returned to their lives. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, as conversations hesitantly resumed and the illusion of normalcy attempted to return, it was clear that nothing was truly the same, because in a single evening, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, without seeking recognition, one quiet woman had reminded everyone present of a truth they could not escape, that dignity does not ask for permission, and the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, will always find its way to be heard. And in that moment, the room did not applaud, it did not celebrate, it simply remembered.